Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Michael Nadorff. I am a clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychology at Mississippi State University, and I'm very thankful to be able to present our Alliance Project training to you all today. So in the Alliance Project, as you'll see, our goal is to provide skills in order to help people interact with someone who is in distress and may be suicidal, and then help get that person referred for further treatment. So we'll be talking as we go along with why that is important and those steps. But first, I want to give a little context to who we are and what we're doing. So this is part of a Garrett Lee Smith suicide prevention grant, youth suicide prevention grant, that is from SAMHSA and awarded to the Mississippi Department of Mental Health. And we are a partner with them. So we are very thankful to be able to work with them on this and also to be able to bring it to you. So to give you a sense of what today's training is and is not about, our goal is to help you learn how to identify someone who's at stress, especially younger adults, but you'll see the examples we do are broader than that. So we do cover both adult and younger adult. Talking about how to be a good listener, build a connection, an alliance with a younger adult, but also, again, more broadly, how do you build that connection with someone very quickly when you don't already have that established? And then we'll talk about how do you actually then bring in services? How do you encourage them to seek out services? We'll talk a little bit about referrals in the area. And ideally, normally we practice skills during this, but we'll talk about what that looks like. Now, our goal is not to train you how to be a counselor or a psychologist or a mental health provider. We know that that's not the audience for today's training. But instead, our goal is to help you both know how to help with those of us in those professions, identify those who are at risk and get them to us, and also to know what resources are available. So I was told that this is a group that will really like statistics. So we have some of the basic ones that we present to everyone on this slide, and then I go into more detail on the coming slides. But overall, suicide is the second leading cause of death for those that are younger, so 10 to 34. Overall, it's the 10th leading cause of death, and it resulted in over 48,000 deaths by suicide in 2018 in the US. So we'll talk more about that on the coming slides. Why is this important? Why is this training important? Why do we do this? So often I think it's easy to say, well, it's the mental health professionals or these systems' jobs to ensure safety, to make sure that those that are suicidal are identified and treated. However, we just don't have the numbers of that nationwide, and we really don't in Mississippi. So I actually, a couple of years ago, on a day that I had too much free time, I went and I looked at the psychiatrists that were board certified in Mississippi. And then I subtracted out all of those who did not actually have a Mississippi address. And I found that Mississippi has 233 psychiatrists. That's to cover a state, you're talking, 3 million people? We don't have enough. And if you look at psychologists in my profession, we have the lowest number of psychologists per capita of any state. We're around 11 psychologists for every 100,000 residents. So with that, we're stretched thin. We're stretched thin even with just providing treatment. So as far as also identifying those at risk and making the referral, we need help. So the goal of this is to broaden the net, broaden that safety net of those who are trained to help identify those who are at risk so they can be referred, so that we can actually get them into treatment and hopefully get them pointed in the right direction. So again, looking a little bit at the stats, just because I think it's helpful. We talked about the 48,000 suicides in the U.S., but with any large numbers, as you know, it's really hard to get a sense of how many that really is. So I find it's helpful to look at other causes of death, not in any way to minimize them, but again to help give context to how large this really is. So when you think of lightning, we take a lot of precautions to prevent or not suicides, deaths by lightning. We'll clear out sports stadiums back when people went to sports stadiums. We will clear out pools. We tell you not to stand under a tree. All of these are good prevention strategies, and they're warranted because on average there are about 50 people that lose their lives due to lightning every year in the U.S. Another thing that we take a lot of precautions with are fire. So with fires, the statute is that you're supposed to have a fire alarm in every bedroom of a house. You're also, you regularly do fire drills at schools, and all of this is good. These are good prevention strategies. And we need them because there are about 3,000 deaths by fire in the U.S. every year. I should mention these are from Worcester, so these are CDC data. Likewise, we have a lot of precautions with drownings. We have lifeguards at a lot of pools. We certainly have warning signs when there isn't a lifeguard on duty. Again, very good, very important because there are 4,000 drownings in the U.S. every year. Homicides. Now we're getting into ones that people, hear about a lot more. So homicides, if you live in a big city, you're going to hear about all the time. When I lived in Houston, Texas, I heard about a couple every single night. So you think that these have to be quite prevalent, and indeed they are. There are about 19,000 homicides in the U.S. every year, but you'll notice that's still less than half the number of suicides. Lastly, one that I want to talk about, just to again help show the magnitude, is auto vehicle accidents. We hear about auto accidents quite often, and again, there are a lot of precautions we take. This is why we have speed limits. This is why we wear seat belts, have airbags, we police the speed limits like we do. And it's important because there are over 40,000 auto deaths every year in the U.S. So again, I don't point this out in any way to minimize these other causes of death or to say that we should do any less prevention, but I think it helps give context to just how prevalent suicide really is in the U.S. And that's hard to get your head around sometimes because of the availability heuristic. So what availability heuristic is that the things that you hear about most are the things that you think are going to be most common. So if you hear more about auto deaths than suicides, you're going to assume without other information that auto deaths are much more prevalent than suicides. However, we've had that for a lot of years where we haven't heard as much about suicide, in part because there's been a great stigma related to suicide. And that's done a lot better over the years, but we still have it. And so you still hear about other causes of death more frequently, even though suicide is very common. And lastly, again, 10th leading cause of death overall. One thing that's amazing is even though it's in the top 10 cause of death, you really don't hear about this, but the suicide rate has gone up every year for more than the last decade. And when I say gone up, I don't mean by a little bit. So these are looking at 2009 to 2018 data. And we see overall the suicide rate has gone up 23%. And when you look at, for youth, so 15 to 24, you're up over 45 or at 45%, almost a 50% increase, a huge increase. Our suicide rate is actually highest right now in the 45 to 54 category. And we see that group has seen an increase, as has older adults. But really, it's the youth suicides that are really driving the increases that we're seeing. We've seen suicide increases across demographic groups, so both men and women, white and non-white. And actually what we see is that a lot of the minority groups, where in the past we thought of them as more protected with suicide, for instance, Black and African Americans, um, they have seen very significant increases, especially among the youth in recent years. So, this is something that's really important. If you actually look at the literature, there's a recent paper in Bulletin where it was Joe Franklin and colleagues. They did a meta-analysis of the suicide literature in the last decade. And they found some really startling things, but things that I think are important for us to know as public health professionals. So first, they found that we really haven't improved our ability to predict suicide in the last 50 years. So even though our literature has come a long way, even though people like me have done a lot of research, we're really no better than we used to be at predicting suicide. And another thing that's striking is that if you actually look at how good we are at predicting suicide, it's basically a coin flip. It's 50-50 shot. That's not good. We have a lot of work to do on predicting. And because of that, really what mental health professionals are doing is they're classifying risk right now. They're not trying to predict because we're just not there. But it shows, again, how far away we are and just how much work there is in this area that needs to be done. Oops, sorry about that. So this is just looking at pure frequency for suicide, youth suicides in the state. And it's a little bit deceptive because it is frequency. And this is 2005 to 2014. It is frequency, so obviously you're going to have higher rates. And, well, they're not rates, they're frequencies. So you'll have higher frequencies in the areas that have higher populations. So no surprise there. What I point out, though, is that every community, every county is affected. The lowest number on here is 3. So this is a problem statewide. This is not a local, this is not just one area. This is a statewide issue. And when you look at youth suicide, again, just because it's the focus of our grant, we'll talk more broadly too, but I think sometimes the youth suicide catches people's attention more. If you look at Mississippi youth suicide, we average 1 per week somewhere in the state. 1 per week. And, I think many of us can think of one that's happened in our community. We had one a couple years ago in Starkville, and it really shook the community. It had a huge impact, and it has a huge impact on the other kids in the schools and, just across the whole community. It really is terrible. And we have that every week somewhere in the state. There's a lot to be done, and that's why we're here. So, talking about risk factors, a lot of these you'll already know, some you may not. One of the things that a lot of people ask me about is social media, especially with youth and adolescents. And I think that's becoming more and more of an issue for a couple of reasons. So first of all, because of that bullying piece. So, social media and the internet in general makes it very easy to be able to pick on someone or haze someone and have it not even be necessarily easy to track back to a certain individual doing it. You can do a lot of damage with that, a lot easier than you could when I was a kid. And that's a struggle. There's also a lot of social comparison that happens with it. For all of us, usually we post our happy events. We don't post, the fact that maybe my 6-year-old daughter was, melting down at Walmart last night. And with that, it gives a tainted view, a positive skew on what everyone's life is like. So as far as social comparison, a lot of times people look and they'll look at their friends and say, well, they're doing so much better than I am. They don't have the same struggles that we do. Well, usually they do. It's just that we don't post about our struggles as much, except for the couple people that only post about their struggles. So with that, I think social media gives a unfair comparison that people base off of a lot of times. Lack of connectedness is a huge risk factor. So there are two um, risk factors, primary risk factors, that have been hypothesized to be associated with a desire for suicide in the current leading theory of suicide, which in my mind is Joyner's interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. And those are a it's thwarted belongingness, which you can think of as this lack of connectedness. It's a feeling like you don't belong, um, and also perceived burdensomeness. Also thought of sometimes as that your death is worth more than your life. We also know that obviously unemployment, poverty, these things play a role. Domestic violence, substance use is huge. Um, I think financial struggles across the board are a much bigger suicide risk factor than people give them trouble for, or credit for rather, in part because of all the things that they're related to. So, they're really related to a much higher divorce rate, a lot more relationship problems, a lot more stress, and as well as depression and the main psychopathology that we think of. So there are a lot of stressors, especially that people are dealing with right now with either layoffs or fear of layoffs or, you know, taking pay cuts, just worries about staying well, additional struggles with taking care of your family or other people where you are the primary caregiver. So a lot going on that can represent a risk factor for suicide. Um, these numbers, I think, often surprise people. So I already mentioned that there's one youth suicide in Mississippi a week, but just the amount of suicidal behavior that occurs, I think, is really notable. So when you look at high school students, we see about 1 in 6 seriously considered attempting suicide in the last year. 1 in 7 actually made a plan to attempt suicide, and 1 in 8 reported having attempted suicide in the last year. Now, we may not be aware of many of these. Actually, thankfully, most don't result in going to the hospital for treatment. But still, this is a very high rate, and um, so it's worth being aware that this is happening, very prevalent in these youth. And that's why we need such a broad net and so much help with identifying those who are at risk and trying to get them into treatment. And then again, just going over something I mentioned earlier, if you look at individuals 10 to 22, there's one every week that dies by suicide on average over the last 10 years. That's heartbreaking. As a parent too, it's absolutely heartbreaking. So we won't get too much into fact or fiction with suicide, but I do think one that is always good to talk about because it's something that people worry about is if asking a person if they're having thoughts of suicide will lead the person to be more at risk, to possibly act upon those thoughts. So you're going to give them the idea. And there have been many studies on this in youth and college students, across the lifespan. And it's been debunked several times. It's an absolute myth. Actually, there's some literature showing that if you asked about suicide in youth, it actually, when you follow up with them, leads to a slightly decreased risk. Um, so you're not going to break anyone by asking about suicide. Now, that said, I'm a big believer, and in our training, we don't focus on teaching you how to ask about suicide, which most others do, because I don't think it's necessary for most of us. Because ultimately, if you are worried enough about someone that you think you need to ask them if they're suicidal, I don't care what their answer is, they need to be referred. So some of you are going to be in settings where you need to ask about suicide, others of you won't. So if you are in a setting where you asked about suicide, it's good to know that you're not going to cause any harm by doing it. But also, I don't think you're going to cause any harm by not doing it. And I mention this because um, it's a huge barrier to actually getting people to implement these interventions. So again, I know this is a public health crowd, so you'll appreciate this. Um, an intervention is only as good as if you'll use it. It's only as good as the adherence to it. And in our data, we've done a good amount of program evaluation with our grants over the years, and we find that over a third of the people that we were training when we did the trainings that insisted on asking about suicide, over a third, reported that they would not do it. You know, if put in the situation, they would not engage in the behaviors we were training them to do. And a big barrier was that there was this discomfort in asking about suicide. So I'm a big believer that I don't want that to be a barrier. That shouldn't stand in the way of intervening. So know that if you do ask about suicide, it's not a bad thing. You're not going to cause harm, but it's also not a necessary thing. I think it's helpful to talk about stress and to think about stress as far as thinking about predictors of suicide. So again, yeah, I hinted at this earlier with our risk factors, but anything that causes stress can lead to the predictors that we commonly think of. And I think with stress, it's good to realize that we're not just talking about bad things. It's also sometimes good things, but we'll get into that more. So stress, we know, is a common body reaction to a demand. And what we're looking for is when stress leads to distress. So this can be manifest in many different ways. So this can be sleep problems, another area that I study, feeling helpless, feeling socially withdrawn and or pulling back, not feeling that belonging because you are pulling back, you're disconnecting from your support, your support groups, or again, feeling like a burden. And again, you have happy and sad stress. So with this, we often think of the sad stressors, and obviously these things can certainly be predictors of suicide. But there are a lot of happy things that lead to a lot of stress. So if any of you have planned a wedding, you know that this can be a very stressful thing. For being the quote unquote happiest day of your life, there's a lot of stress in there. It's one of those things that's better looking back on it usually than it is during the moment. Um, so a lot of these can bring stress with them, and that's important to keep in mind. And again, we're looking for that transition from stress to distress. So in our training, we try to train individuals on 5 steps that we believe are really important to helping. So we have identifying distress, breaking the ice with the individual, building rapport, sharing information and making a plan, and then a follow-up. So first, looking at identifying distress. So one of the things that we do when we do this training live is we talk to people about what are the ways that you express when you feel overwhelmed? How does that manifest? And how would people notice if you were feeling this way? And so we elicit those ideas from the audience, and then we go into some examples to help illustrate that. So with that, here we have a scenario. I won't read it to you, but I'll give you enough time. But go ahead and take a peek at the scenario with Sam and Alex, and we'll talk about it a little bit more here in a second. Okay, so as you can see, this is a scenario many of us unfortunately can relate to, and or we certainly have those in our lives that are experiencing these sorts of challenges. And so with that, what are some indications that may concern you for Sam or for Alex? So, here, looking at Sam, certainly you have that anxiety, that stress relating to furlough, and the potential loss of paycheck, for the family. And then with Alex, you have a couple different things. So here, um, we're observing a lot of those warning behaviors that we talked about. So we see that Alex hasn't been reaching out to the friends, those supports during this time. And again, that's super important because we know that connectedness is a huge protection against suicide. And on the flip side, loneliness is a real risk factor. Also, staying up until 4 a.m. and not sleeping, and then later sleeping all day. Um, Actually, if you look at it hour by hour, so most suicides occur during the day, but actually Michael Perlis has done some really cool sleep research with this, where when you actually control for how many people are awake at any given hour, um, the rate for suicide is very, very high during the night. Um, so his saying is that suicidal behavior occurs when reason sleeps, and that is during the night. And there's a lot to be said for that, and we know that sleep problems are a risk factor for suicide. That's actually my research program is showing that. So that's certainly something we need to be concerned about. And also feeling that there's no point in doing anything. So showing anhedonia, which is another way of saying basically not having any enjoyment in things, especially things that used to be associated with pleasure. So those are some of the things that to me stand out as far as worry. We certainly have stressors for this family, and specifically for Alex, um, we're seeing that there are behaviors that are concerning to us. So how do we break the ice? Well, this is one of the things that is one of the hardest things to do. And I always say to illustrate this, if this were easy, we wouldn't have a bunch of cheesy pickup lines. It's true. I mean, think about it. We have cheesy pickup lines because it's not easy to break the ice. So what we did is we actually looked in the literature, and there's not as much on this as you would think in the psychological literature. Where you find it is actually the sales literature, because they have to do this all the time. If you're in sales, you're constantly trying to build rapport very quickly and make a connection with someone. And so what we know about breaking the ice is there are a lot of different ways to do this, but a couple ways to do it are, of course, to introduce yourself and try to invite them into a conversation. And for me, a lot of times, there are a couple different ways I'll do this. So one, as it says, is you can ask them how they're doing, just straight out. Maybe you're not ready for that. Maybe you need to work up to that. Um, what I like to do is I like to try to find something that I have in common with the person, uh, whatever that may be. So I worked at Mississippi State, so um, there's always the football team, and there's always things that we have in common based on being at MSU or being affiliated with MSU. Maybe there's something I see on their backpack or something else I observe about them that's going to give me a clue about things that are important to them that we may share that I might be able to introduce myself with. It's like, hey, I see you're also into this. Maybe they're playing Pokemon. Maybe I play Pokemon. Yeah, I see that you're also hunting for Pokemon. How do you enjoy that? So just something to connect. If you have nothing, sports worked well for a lot of people. Another thing that people don't think about that's worked surprisingly well for me is Food Network. It's amazing how many people watch cooking shows. And if nothing else, usually food, all of us, for the most part, have some food we like. So often there's something that we can find that we have in common that can help with that initial awkwardness of breaking the ice. So here, what we would normally do is we talk through what are ways that you could break the ice with either Sam or Alex. So with Sam, you know, it's, since it is one of your close friends, it's not as hard because you already have that relationship, right? So I would probably just outright ask, it's like, hey, I know that this has been going on and it seems to be really weighing on you. How are you doing? How have you been holding up with everything at work and in general the pandemic? I think that's actually a good thing that we should ask all of our friends right now, regardless, because there are a lot of struggles that we're not seeing with all of us doing more and more from home, isolated away from other people. Alex is harder because Alex, let's say we don't have a connection with Alex. Maybe we know who Alex is, but I don't have a relationship with Alex. Here's where I think it's really helpful to have something, that you can build off in common. So if you know that Alex plays football, maybe you played football, maybe you just like football and follow football. You can talk about football. Maybe Alex does something else. Maybe Alex does cheerleading. Maybe Alex, whatever it is, maybe Alex likes cooking shows. It really is good. I use that surprisingly a ton when I worked at a cancer center. And you think these are people undergoing chemotherapy. The last thing they'd want to talk about is food. No, no, actually, they really want to talk about food. So you'd be surprised how far you can do with food. But having something that you have in common or something where you can draw the person in is really helpful. So that's what I like to practice is having a couple go-tos that I can always use. Whether it's talking MSU football or talking Food Network or talking, there's always the weather, and it's that's an easy one. It's something we all have in common, right? And it's really funny if you again, why would you ever do this? But for me, I've worked in psychology clinics for a long, long time, and if you ever sit in a waiting room and just listen to people as they go by, it's always this awkward time between the waiting room and when you get into the therapy room where it feels like there needs to be some type of conversation, but you don't want to get into anything that's private. And so therapists all use the same go-to. We all talk about weather. And it's so funny to just hear it where you see the person come, get their client and then ask about the weather or talk about the weather or talk about how much it's been raining without fail. So weather's always a good go-to. It's one of the mental health favorites. So now we're going to get into building rapport. So hopefully we've made that initial connection. So now we're going to try to build upon that relationship and try to build it into a relationship. So what we usually will do is we will, when we're live in person, play the I Connect game. So with this, we're going to have it where we have groups usually of 3, and we have people start talking about themselves. And they go until there's something else that someone can either connect with or has in common. And then that person will say, I connect. And then they will do the same and talk about themselves until the next person has the same, a similar connection. And what it shows very quickly is just how much we all have in common. And even if it may not be something that you would immediately think that we'd have a lot in common. But it's the whole... 5 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever it is. All of us have odd things in common because the world is a smaller place than we often think it is, especially if you live in a small town. So once you're starting to have the conversation with the person, what are ways to build rapport? What are ways to build that relationship quickly? And this is again where we took from both the psychological literature, but we really took a lot from the literature in sales too. So first is uncommonly attentive. This is something that is one of the first things you learn when you're going into becoming a counselor or a psychologist. But otherwise, you don't really practice this. So it's one of my favorite things to practice where what you do is, and often you start very small, like 2-minute conversation where you focus solely on a person and what they're saying and you block everything out. And when you haven't done that and learned to do that, it is exhausting. It's really hard to do. It's really important though, because A, that person needs to feel that connection, and B, it's not uncommon for these discussions to happen in inopportune places. So It's great when it's in a private office. Hopefully, it is in a private office. This may be under the bleachers at a football game. And you're going to need to block out all those things that are going on around you and be able to focus in on just what is going on. So, being able to focus on that person and be entirely present and just focus on what they're saying. And one of the things that I think, especially early on, that's really helpful is don't worry about trying to solve the problem. Your job is to just listen to it and make sure you understand it first. So don't jump ahead and try to think of what you're going to say or how you're going to respond. Um, Focus on just listening and comprehending. And then if you need, what you can do is after you do that, say, okay, you've told me a lot. Let me give me just a second to kind of process this and to be able to respond, in a thoughtful way. Something like that. Just it shows the person that they're being heard, but also it gives you time to process what was said and to think of the response during a time that you're not also trying to listen to them. So courteous behavior. So one of my favorites here is the unexpected honesty and authenticity. So this is where sometimes, for me, my style clinically is self-disclosure. I will disclose more than some other therapists. Some say you don't do any. For me, it feels natural to do some. So if I've struggled with something, if there's something I can relate with, usually I'll say that. And it's like, I had a tough time with that too when I was growing up. Or, I found that, when I was in this situation, you know, I really struggled with it. And, I had these issues. I'm wondering if you're having similar struggles as I did. Um, if that is authentic for you, if that feels true to you, it's a great tool. If it doesn't, if it's fake, if you're trying to put it on, don't use it. If it's fake, people will see through it right away. But if it's true to you, if it's authentic to you, it's a good thing to use. Common ground is often what we talked about earlier, having something in common as far as interests or things of that things of that nature. So this is also where pets can come in really handy. So this is my colleague's dog, and so you can talk about pets. You can talk about other things that you may have in common. But having something that you have in common is a really good way to build rapport with someone quickly. And then also just sometimes small talk, just anything where the person feels supported and not alone. And also, if there's one thing you're going to do that is therapeutic in nature, try to build hope. We know that hope is one of the best predictors, one of the biggest safety nets against suicidal behavior, and hopelessness is one of the worst things on earth. So anything you can do to give hope, even if it's just, you're struggling a lot, I don't necessarily know how to help you, but I know who does. And I'm very confident in the way you can get you to the right people to help get you on the right track. But I need you to work with me to help get you there. But I'd love to work with you to help make sure you get to the right person, because we can fix this. You haven't told me anything that we can't fix, even if it doesn't feel that way. So building hope is really a helpful thing. So then, we'll talk about what are things that you can do with Sam or with Alex. So, and we already touched on that, so I'll skip that. But just getting people thinking about that. One of the things I love to talk about is, again, I think a lot in barriers. The things that people have told me over the years prevent them from using these skills. And a big one is, what if I mess up? So things that are helpful are being direct and open about it. And if you made a mistake, owning it. So, this may be if you go up to Alex and you're like, I don't understand why you're struggling. You're a 4.0 student. You have everything in front of you. Like you're doing great. It's fine. It can't be that bad. Well, that's not very validating. That's not a great response. And you may realize that. You may see the look on Alex's face and realize that, and then you'll say, let me take that back. Let me try to start over, because that wasn't very understanding of me. And I want to start over and try to actually understand what's going on. That was me just assuming things. So would you be willing to tell me what's going on for you and what are your struggles. Um, Try to be non-judgmental and show interest, and be that support, be a connection for that person. You know, you don't want to catch yourself debating, the value of life or death, or um, trying to convince them, you know, one way or the other. Like ultimately you're trying to make a connection, and you're trying to build that connection enough to get someone to say, maybe even the person's trying to engage in a debate on life or death. Say, I think life is worth living, but it's not even worth debating. But what is important is I think that there are ways that we can make your life better. And I know that there are people we can link you with that can help you. And wouldn't it be good to go and talk with one of those people first before trying to decide whether or not it's worth continuing your life? Because, if life can get better, what do you have to lose? If this can all be fixed, what do you have to lose to give it a shot to see if maybe we can improve your life, save your life? Yeah, another thing you don't want to say is, now you wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? It's one of those things, it comes out very easily, but it's very judgmental when you think about it. And also, of course, you don't want to be sworn to secrecy on anything, because then how are you going to tell the people that need to be told? So don't let yourself get caught in the trap of being sworn to secrecy. If people ask me about that, I'll say, I can't promise that. It depends on what you tell me. But what I can tell you is I'm in your corner, and I'm not trying to make things harder, but I do need to link you with the people that are appropriate depending on what you tell me. So I'm asking for your trust, and that I'm not going to try to make things worse. I'm going to try to link you, if I need to, with the people that will help make things better. But people appreciate the honesty. People, if you goof up, it's amazing just how much, leeway you can get from owning it. So then we're going to share information and make a plan. And so here, what you're doing is, after you've listened fully to Alex or to Sam, and you get a sense of what it is that the problem is, you start thinking, okay, what are the needs? And we've talked a lot about mental health, but it doesn't have to be that. Maybe the person needs academic support, maybe some other type of support. But it's figuring out what are the things that would be helpful for the person, what are the resources that would be helpful, and then make a plan with them to make that happen. Ideally, it's great to do a warm handoff. So you want to be with the person as much as possible. Actually going with them if possible. And but if nothing else, maybe you say, let's even call together and just make the appointment, just so I know that that's set, so you don't have to worry about it, and I'll feel better knowing that has been taken care of. But think of it as the person, what would be helpful in this moment? What is the thing that is the biggest struggle you have? Now, as far as some resources, it's good to know every part of Mississippi. I know the names are blurry, but hopefully you know roughly where you are. Every area of Mississippi has a Department of Mental Health community counseling group that is responsible for that region. And here are your groups. So I know I'm not going to have these up here very long, but hopefully you'll be able to see which one is yours. If not, it's all on the Department of Mental Health website. Also, every one of these regions has a mobile crisis response team. And these are the numbers for those teams. And it's not a bad thing to just take a picture of this, just so you always have it for wherever you're at. But it's important, these are 24-hour numbers. So, yeah, if you're in a situation where you have someone that is in crisis, here's a local number to call to try to get help and get that person immediately into services. There are also a lot of national resources that you can use. So National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Something that a lot of people don't realize is there's a text line especially for youth. This is often the preferred way to utilize these resources. So, feel free to text them. And this is something I've done before, with someone there, where I will text them and show, and they never, at least for me, have minded, if I say I'm just showing the person what it's like to do this, and they understand because they want people to use these services. There's also disaster distress helpline. Lifeline and Trevor Project are especially good for, well, trans for those who identify as trans, but also Trevor Project with LGBT, um, because they're going to be able to ensure that the person that you reach is actually trained and is able to be properly affirming. So those are really good resources for those. Lastly, just talking about follow up. Um, it's not over once you have linked someone. Be sure to follow back up with Sam or with Alex. Make sure everyone okay. Make sure they actually made it to that appointment. Make sure they're getting the help they need. And if not, then work with them to, try to find other ways to make sure that they're getting assistance. So don't just leave it with referral. Be sure to finally close the loop with just checking back in after and making sure that it was a successful referral. Now, lastly, I'll mention, we really appreciate you having us for this training today. And with it, we actually provide this training statewide free of charge. We're a grant-funded project, so we will actually come to you. We won't charge you anything, even for the travel. And we will still do some of these actually in person, but also we do them virtually. So please feel free to get in touch with Rachel-Clair Franklin. She's our lead trainer. And again, a major part of her job is doing these trainings. And with that, you're actually doing us a great favor by linking us with those in your community that might be willing to host one of these trainings. So if you're linked with a church or with a youth group or anything, a school group, Boys and Girls Club, please help link us up with groups in your area, because we're trying to get the word out about this and get it so we have as many people trained as possible in how to help with these situations. So please help us with that, and thank you again for your time and attention today.